incredible organizations and NGOs and travel companies and conservation organizations as well. Now, when Helen first asked if I would speak, it was a little bit like, well, wait, I'm so used to speaking about tourism, and sustainable tourism and how to focus on environmental conservation and the climate crisis. But then I took a step back and realized, well, actually, even though a lot of the projects that I focused on aren't necessarily categorized as climate crisis, the underlying causes are, meaning deforestation and changing weather patterns and natural disasters and things like that. So in the course of, hopefully I'll try and make it brief in the next 20, 30 minutes, I'm going to share a couple stories of kind of examples of climate change and kind of women and some ideas and solutions from projects around the world, and trying to connect it back to perhaps some of the things that you're working on, or whether you're thinking about carbon offsets, you're evaluating them, you're also looking at different projects with local communities. You're going to notice communities comes up a lot in the next few slides, because that's where a lot of our work is focused. And even though a lot of my work is connected to kind of communications and marketing, it's also been grounded in kind of evaluating different projects and also developing new products and kind of iterating products along the way. So just briefly before I jump into some of the stories, and when I say we, I mean my husband, my partner, Dan, and I, because we work together most of the time on projects. This is kind of our approach to kind of shared value tourism or sustainable tourism. And even though I know most of you are not working in tourism, I imagine that some of this might resonate in terms of trying to understand the shared value of our projects and our work, whether it's climate tech focused, whether it's sustainability focused, whether it's finance focused, in terms of trying to find the overlaps and the benefits and the shared values with our customers, with the communities we work with, and also for our business in terms of differentiating our projects, having a brand story, and bringing our customers along with the journey, because we all need to work together right now. Unfortunately, the climate crisis is such that working together is the only way we're going to really kind of get through it, not get through it, but address it in the best way. So the first project that I wanted to talk about is from northern Tanzania, and it's the Masi Stoves and Solar Project. And just briefly, the Masi are an ethnic group who live primarily in Tanzania and Kenya. And they originally were kind of nomadic, pastoral. The men took care of the cattle. Women are responsible for taking care of children, for cooking, which also includes going out and finding firewood, going out and collecting water. And one of the things that with continued drought and also with continued search for firewood and other things like that, deforestation and desertification is happening quite a lot around Masi communities. So one of the projects we worked on a few years ago was with the Masi Stoves and Solar Project, connected with G Adventures, and they're an adventure travel tour company based out of Canada. And their nonprofit arm, which is called Planetara Foundation. And Planetara essentially works with local community organizations and social enterprises and looks at how tourism and kind of integrating kind of some of the community work into tourism can provide a more continual kind of sustainable source of funding for these projects. And I have to admit that when we were asked to go to visit a clean cook stoves project, my first impression was like, oh, that sounds really boring. Like, how are we going to make this interesting? But then we got on the ground, and it turns out that clean cook stoves are actually much more interesting than they might appear. First of all, this is a photo. This is Mela, our host for the day. And you can see there her clean cook stove with the little dogs next to them. Now, it's hard to give the impression of how important it is that 90% of the smoke is removed within a hut. After we visited Mela, we went next door to a hut that did not have a clean cook stove. And the coordinator from the NGO said, at the beginning, if you can't take it anymore, just let me know. And I thought, wow, he's being really dramatic, how bad can this be? I'm used to dust and buses and whatever. And literally within a few minutes, Dan and I couldn't breathe. Our eyes were watering. I mean, just the smoke is incredible when people are cooking. So it's an incredible project in terms of the health benefits, especially for children, but also in terms of the environment. It is so efficient that it uses an estimated 60 kilograms less wood per week. And on the one hand, you might think, oh, okay, 60 kilograms, yeah, that sounds like a lot. But now imagine going out 5 times a week in order to go collect that wood. And as we were talking to the women, they were saying, well, actually, the forests are getting further and further away because, they're stripping the forest of the wood in order to cook. And so it was estimated that just by reducing the amount of wood allowed them to reduce the number of times that they went out to the forest, which actually saved them about 10 or 12 hours a week of wood collecting. And then on top of that, some of them were saying, yeah, I've started a garden, I can spend more time with my kids. So there's a whole quality of life aspect of this, in addition to, the environmental and the ecological considerations. And it does lower, each cook stove is estimated to lower carbon emissions by about 3.6 tons per year, which is pretty incredible when you think this is just one family, one stove. And one of the things that was great was when we started finding out about this project or asking questions, I thought, well, cook stove is a cook stove is a cook stove. And we were informed, well, actually, the organizer of this project originally brought a cook stove from Zanzibar, which is also part of Tanzania. It's an island. And they kind of assumed, Zanzibar, Moshi, this is near Moshi and Arusha, same. But the women took one look and were like, we're never going to use that. Like, that just will not work for us. And so the women in the community actually ended up spending the next 18 months retrofitting this cook stove for them, for their specific purpose, for what they cooked, for how they cooked. And then once they got to that stage, then of course the men came in and we're like, okay, now we're ready to get involved. We want to do all the installation. We've got, this is how much it's going to cost. And because of all the work done with the women up till that point, the women basically said, no way. Like, we did all the work. We're the ones who are going to be involved in the installation and carrying this through. And so what the project ended up doing was they ended up training engineering teams to go out to the different villages to install the cook stoves. And they also installed solar panels. So it was actually kind of interesting to see, you're kind of in the middle of nowhere and there's a little kind of chimney for the stove and the solar panel on the other side. And this provided a source of income for the women, which was quite important because traditionally the men were the ones, with the animals, that's where the income was earned. And so with the employment and with this leadership role, what they found was that, some of the women that we talked to, they were investing that money more, in healthcare for their kids and education. And because of the solar panels, it also allowed, kids to have more time in the evening to read and kind of just better quality of life, to have more connection. And one of the ways that it connected to G Adventures was that they decided that for all the tours that go to the Serengeti, that go on safari, so travelers have a chance to see the big five, the lions and giraffes and everything else. A portion of that tour fee would go to buy a clean cook stove and a solar panel for a home. So that way there's kind of a continual kind of sourcing as well. So it wasn't just a one-time thing, but it was continual. That was until COVID-19. So now actually Planet Terra is working with a lot of the communities to figure out alternative sources of funding when there is no tourism, but that's a different issue. And another really cool thing is I was researching to find an update is because the engineering teams are going out to visit all these different communities, they also started identifying other needs in the communities, including widows. So they started developing kind of support groups for widows and kind of showing the leadership to young women growing up. This woman is Isopat. She's kind of a dynamo. Her name means the one who cares for others, which is quite appropriate. Her nickname was Airport because she was the first woman in the community to ever fly in an airplane, because she kind of took on this leadership role and ended up being a spokesperson. And they ended up sending her, I think, somewhere in South America to teach other women there how to install clean cook stoves and how to kind of set up the program. But one of the things that I found, in terms of lessons for this is this idea that one size does not fit all. And often in our businesses, we're focused on, localize, we need to customize. But from the work that we've done in the field, we find that a lot of times people think, oh, if it worked over there, it should work over here. And it's just so important, no matter what you're doing, not to make assumptions, involve local people in the program development from the beginning, because even, when I go into situations, I try and ask as many questions as I can, but there's always stuff that I'm never going to know just because I'm not from there. And so this is the idea of also localizing the production, localizing the ownership, and providing leadership opportunities for women. In this case, as the coordinator joked, it was actually an accident because the women were so kind of outspoken. And also thinking about, you can see the little arrow here. This is Isapat's mobile phone, where she has it in a beautiful, like, braided Masi mobile phone holder that she made. One of the really interesting things being in Tanzania a few years ago was with solar panels and with the expansion, so many more people had mobile phones, and they were using them for banking, they were using them for educational purposes, they were using them to find out the price of different not plants, but different agricultural products, so they wouldn't get ripped off at the market. And so there's also a lot of opportunities to think about creative ways to reach these new markets, or perhaps kind of expanded customer base, because they have, adapting some of your products, your operations, or what you're doing actually might work for this kind of new group, because they are kind of coming more online, literally. Oops. For some reason, my screen is not working. Okay, there it goes. So staying in Africa, also on the theme of deforestation and kind of local projects. This is Soazara, and they are located in Madagascar, started by a couple who actually ran an eco lodge. And Madagascar is an incredible country. The biodiversity there is incredible, amazing, but also 90% of the original forests are gone due to deforestation. And a lot of that has to do with agriculture, and a lot of that has to do with firewood, because the local traditional cooking requires coal from fire or from trees. And so what I really enjoyed about, or what I thought was great about this project, is that they had this kind of grand plan to make a green corridor. They've planted 100,000 trees already. I think they have a plan for another like 200,000 or 300,000 trees in the next couple of years, in order to give more space to the animals, in order to actually bring the lemurs back, because a lot of them, without a lot of space, then they've moved on, or they've kind of died out. So to provide kind of more space for the animals. But they also were very realistic and said, well, people use charcoal for the cooking, and even this community just needs 160,000 trees a year just to support cooking. So what they decided to do was, instead of just focusing on the green corridor, which, to be honest, sounds great for marketing, they actually had a whole project dedicated to what they call quick trees. So these were eucalyptus and other trees, and they created forests, or kind of tree projects, just dedicated to charcoal, because they knew if they didn't address that need, then people would go into the bigger forest in order to cut down trees. And so this is an important lesson that unfortunately sometimes I don't see happening, where people are focused on, like, we need to just plant trees, we need to bring the forest back, but they're not actually addressing the immediate needs of the local community. And I remember asking our guide when we were there, and I said, well, why don't people just, being from the outside, why don't people just use gas when they're cooking? And he said, well, first of all, most people can't afford it, which is very true. Madagascar is, I think, 4th or 5th considered poorest country in the world. And he said, but also the women wouldn't use it because they think their food doesn't taste as good if it's not made with charcoal. So it's like understanding what are the considerations, what are the factors when thinking about programs, and then when working with local communities. And so, yeah, getting back to kind of some of the lessons is the idea of being realistic, understanding what the immediate needs are for the community and the people. And in this project, as I mentioned, the founders own an eco lodge. And so working with tourists, I was on a G-Adventures trip. So each G-Adventures trip ends up buying about 150 or 200 trees per tour that goes through. So they're getting about 3 or 4 tours a week, which adds up over time. But then also the guests at the hotel end up contributing and getting involved with buying trees. And the money doesn't just go in terms of the saplings, but it actually also goes to employing people. So that again, it's the long-term approach of making sure that local people are involved, local people are empowered or that they own it. And also the importance of youth. I mean, here you have the founder's daughter working together. And one of the things that they're doing is they're actually trying to bring as many kind of school groups and young people together as part of this process as well, for kind of understanding and appreciating the value. So now we're going to head over to Asia, Ladakh. And this is the high Himalayas of India. It's an incredibly beautiful area. And what I've found is that some of the most beautiful areas to visit are actually incredibly difficult areas to live. So this is a high desert, kind of traditional Tibetan Buddhist culture. The Ladakhis, you see here this kind of dynamo woman with her wrenches. And Global Himalayan Expeditions, this is actually a project that I have not visited firsthand. The others I have, but I've spoken with the founder of this organization at World Travel and Tourism Council a couple of years ago, and I know Ladakh because we visited there. So I'm hoping actually to go and visit this project afterwards. But his story and how he tells it is kind of interesting because he's an engineer. And he first started out saying, I want to electrify villages, like that's my goal. And India actually has a CSR law that says, I think if you earn like over $130 million a year, you have to give 2% in CSR. So he capitalized on this and went to a bunch of companies and managed to get funding for solar panels and installation. And, he worked with the villages and stuff and, was pretty successful in electrifying some villages. But then he realized, well, local people are leaving, like the young people are leaving because these are remote areas. These are villages, they're rural, it's hard, and they don't see any opportunities for themselves. So he ended up switching kind of his focus still on electrifying villages, but then also focusing on the livelihood and creating opportunities, especially for young people. And what he found when he went back to the companies who had given him money, CSR, as part of their CSR funding, they weren't interested in any of that. They said, well, we'll give you money for the solar panels, but we're not interested in training or we're not interested in kind of focusing on the livelihood stuff because we can't write that up within a year. Like we need to have a start and a finish. So he started thinking, okay, how can I expand this or how can I kind of get this continual source of funding and work on the training? So we ended up setting up treks where groups of travelers come together and as part of their tour fee, they actually buy all the panels and they end up hiking out to a village and working with the village to install it as a way to kind of as part of their journey, but also as a way to kind of understand life in these areas as well. And actually this organization this year won the 2020 UN Global Action Award, or one of them. And it was the first tourism organization that ever did it, or that ever won this award. So this group is a pretty interesting group. So again, what he started focusing on was livelihood programs, training women to set up homestays, and again, focusing on women, because this organization, as many other people as we know, studies have shown that when you invest in women, you're investing in the children. And this is actually a homestay family that Dan and I did stay with a few years ago on our own trek. And also looking at ways to give them leadership roles in clean water management programs, training them as guides, also training them as kind of to maintain the solar panels. Because in order to, as Paras joked, he's like, I realized that I could set up all these beautiful electrified villages, and within 10 or 15 years, if we didn't focus on livelihood, there wouldn't be any people there. And so this is one of the really important things is, with these climate projects, is to make sure to think about the socioeconomic. And this is another cool program that I hope to visit once it's possible to travel again, is they managed to get some telescopes donated, and they started working with some of the young women as like sky guides. So to train how to use the telescopes, but then also to give tours to travelers of the night sky in connection to the homestay. And again, they focused on women because this also provided kind of an unusual role in the community in terms of science and leadership. And it also, again, puts the value on a clean environment, clean skies, and kind of keeping, the environmental protection. And these are, high desert is a hard place to live. And so people have, it is pretty incredible how they have been able to live sustainably. But even when we were there in Ladakh 7 years ago, this is a photo from our trip 7 years ago, people are already saying, well, the glaciers are smaller, which means that, the water that gets melted every year for our agriculture is less and less. And so the agriculture was getting harder and harder. It was already difficult to begin with. And so that's one of the ways that people are adapting, is to think, okay, if we don't have as great yields on our agriculture, what are some other ways that we can earn a living and still stay in the villages and still protect, kind of continue our culture. So this is the idea of, focus on livelihood and employment as part of climate action, integrating kind of it into your product, meaning making it kind of continual and part of your story. And also the importance of telling your story, because as this story began to get, the story of these electrification projects and homestay projects and training began to get out, other communities and other mountain communities around the world started asking, how can we do this? And so now he's working with other communities in Kyrgyzstan, in Nepal, in Vietnam, in ways of how they can adapt kind of what worked in Ladakh to other places as well. And the last story, Kyrgyzstan, which is a place that's very close to my heart because I've done quite a lot of work there. And this is the idea of kind of thinking about and valuing and learning from Indigenous people, because often they are the ones that, this is their land. They know the balance. They're connected very much to nature, to weather, to changing cycles. And Kyrgyzstan has a nomadic culture, traditional nomadic culture. You can see here the yurts, and everything in the yurt is handmade. I mean, that comes the felt, the wood, everything. And a yurt can basically, the fastest that a yurt can be set up is at about 15 minutes in competitions, but it usually takes about an hour. And what happens in Kyrgyzstan is traditionally the families come up in the summertime with their animals. And then once the snow hits, then they go back down again, to lower elevation. But what's happening now is fewer and fewer families are coming up to the Gilo is called is the high, is kind of the highland, because it's difficult. It's not the easiest living. Many times you are removed. Here you actually do see a truck in the background because they're about to take some of the yurts down. But it's often the grandmothers who are the ones who go up there, and they're the ones who are really focused on kind of continuing the traditions and passing it on to their kids or their grandkids. And what's really interesting spending time in a Gilo or spending time in the yurt is just how everything is used. I mean, they find a way to use every single part, from the milk, from this. I mean, the grandmother is making, they call karut, which are like salted yogurt balls that then they put out in the sunshine, and then that way they can eat it for literally months on end. Like everything has kind of this sustainable reused cycle. And it is this really important thing where they are passing on the culture, they are passing on this connection to the land, and also the respect to the land and nature to the younger generations. And one of the colleagues that we have who works there, he said, basically, I learned everything I know about the mountains from my grandmother or from my mother. And so, and we're also thinking about, some of the projects that we're working on programs. I know this group, it's not a hard sell to say invest in women, or, think about women as continuing the knowledge or passing on the knowledge, but also to think about how we can learn from Indigenous communities, because they have been the caretakers of land until now. And there's some really interesting studies coming out showing that when Indigenous communities actually have ownership of the land, that land or that forest or the wetlands or whatever it is tends to be better preserved or conserved than in other hands or another, ownership. So yeah, as I said, Kyrgyzstan has a warm place in my heart because the women are tough. It's not easy living. And even though the men would never admit it, because the men are kind of very macho men, it's the women that kind of keep the traditions going on and on. So just to close up, because I said I would try not to make this too long, just again, trying to pull some lessons from not just the projects that I talked about, but other projects that I've worked on and being out in the field. And First one is, yeah, localize. Just make sure that local people are involved kind of every step of the way. Don't make assumptions, ask questions, listen. Also the importance of livelihood and socioeconomic stability in terms of long-term climate solutions. When thinking about investing in climate action, think about, okay, who are the people involved who live nearby, who are looking for ways to earn money so that way they're not dependent on the forest, or that way they're not dependent on hunting. Also consider some of these areas as growth markets, new services, new products. It's an expanding world. Include women and marginalized communities in leadership roles. That's also another important one. Again, I think that's a pretty easy sell for this group. And also think about continual sources of program funding. That's one of the hardest things for some of these programs and organizations, is program funding is sometimes 1 year, 2 years, 4 years, but to be able to have something that's continual. And that's where maybe partnering with social enterprises or thinking about a social enterprise model might be good. Learning from Indigenous communities as stewards of land and culture. And because I do work in tourism, I'm going to make a kind of shout for next time you do take a vacation, think about how you can incorporate some of these things into your next vacation and your travels, whether it's choosing a community tourism project in the United States, in Europe, working with a social enterprise, a lot of different options. And then finally, because I just saw this the other day and I thought it was relevant, which was the importance of elevating solutions through storytelling. And this is from Ellen Kelsey. She has a new book called Hope Matters: Why Changing the Way We Think is Critical to Solving the Environmental Crisis. And I think it really speaks to a lot of what this organization or what this group is trying to do, which is to share solutions. And the way that she says it is, I believe the way to spread hope is to collectively challenge the tired narrative of environmental doom and gloom that reproduces a hopeless status quo and replace it with an evidence-based argument that improves our capacity to engage with the real and overwhelming issues we face. And only if we believe there's an opportunity to make a real positive impact will we find the motivation to fight for the protection and the restoration of ecosystems we depend on. And that's why I'm actually very excited for this group right here, and look forward to following and seeing what you're doing as well, because I think this is the charge that we all have, as well as the opportunity. So thank you.
Well, hopefully, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Fantastic. And Lisa, I just asked to unmute you as well, because I felt like it would be wonderful for you to say hello. And I'm still a little bit of a dinosaur on all of these controls. Can you hear me, Lisa?
Yeah, I saw the unmute, but have a crying baby in the background and didn't want that to distract.
Sorry, I didn't want to take you by surprise, but I also wanted you to say hi.
No, it's all good. Thank you, Audrey, for your incredible presentation. I really resonate a lot with a lot of your stories, and I think that you are an incredible storyteller yourself, actually.
Thank you.
I really appreciated it. My husband's also from Kenya, so a lot of Maasai overlap, and we actually went and did a Maasai village sort of excursion when we were there last. And it's phenomenal how much smoke is actually in those huts, because they're just full, I mean, they're fully just made of cow dung. So yeah. I remember also being really overwhelmed by that. But yeah, I think that we're obviously, as a group of incredible individuals in this climate tech sphere, I think that there's so much opportunity for us to exactly do what you've done, and really like seek out those stories and highlight them to the forefront. And I know that many women on this call are, looking to do that with their own, journey. So really, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Incredible. We do have a couple of questions. Daniel asked, is there any network, a worldwide community projects to look at when we are considering our next trip?
Very good question. Unfortunately, there isn't one one collection or database. It's actually been a project idea of mine for a while. However, there are quite a few organizations or companies that are incorporating more and more of these types of projects. I mentioned G Adventures is one, there's Intrepid, and they also, they're an interesting organization as well because they're actually carbon neutral. They've put a lot of effort into that. And this doesn't necessarily have to be group trips because they also have kind of private tour options as well. But then also one of the projects that actually I'm about to start work on is an ecotourism consortium for the Mediterranean. It's called the Meat Network. And what they're doing is they're actually developing experiences with protected areas together with tour companies. So that way, again, the money goes back into conservation and also the travelers have a more kind of connected experience in the national parks and protected areas. But I can send Helen a couple of websites or places to kind of get started. But maybe one idea is think about like Googling community tourism or social enterprise and tourism or yeah, and there's Urban Adventures is another organization or another company that has a lot of focus on working with local community, kind of community-based providers or individuals as well. So, but I can provide some more. But yeah, there isn't a good database, unfortunately.
We can share those. We've got a LinkedIn group and we can share some of these resources. And also you can see Audrey's contact information on the screen here. We've had another question on if there's generally a process or plan for electronics or solar power panel recycling for the installed equipment that needs to be upgraded or replaced.
Unfortunately, I don't know that specifically, but I can look into it because I do have contacts with some of these organizations. I know one of the important things from the beginning was the focus on maintenance because unfortunately, there's a lot of projects that focus on installation and not on maintenance. And so these programs that I mentioned right now do have kind of continual maintenance programs where they train local people to kind of take care of it. But in terms of kind of the recycling, that was actually something that I was thinking about when I was putting this together, because it had, for example, it has been a few years since I've been in Tanzania, and I was thinking, okay, how long do those little solar panels actually last? So yeah, actually with a lot of, unfortunately I don't know, but I can look into it or I can ask.
Yeah, this could also be a good question for Solar Sister. Next month, I'm sure they've come across that because equipment will need to be replaced. And yeah, and Laura's just weighed in here. Panels have about a 25-year to 30-year lifespan, and Europe is a leader on recycling. These are fantastic questions. Audrey, we'll circle back on that, and also I think if we can ask that question of our speakers next month too, they might have a thought on that as well. And we're just getting, Audrey, this is a good one. We were talking about this at the very beginning of your presentation. From Rebecca, I'm curious how you grapple with emissions from travel. Airlines and companies are increasingly selling offsets, but that is a partial solution at best.
Very good question. So as I was telling Helen before this started, I was thinking back to some of our early travels, and what I realized is before kind of flight shaming and Greta and everything, we actually did travel overland and kind of avoided planes. We would buy a one-way ticket to a continent or a region and then just travel by bus or train or whatever public transport. So like we arrived in the Republic of Georgia and 8 months later, we were in Shanghai, just by traveling overland. And at the time, I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it to this group. At the time, we didn't necessarily do it for environmental reasons. It's the same thing. We started in Guatemala. We ended up in, Patagonia, Argentina. But for us, it was more about just being able to see the subtle changes in landscapes and environment and cultures and people and economy and, food and architecture. And the best way for us to do that was by traveling overland and by sharing very long bus rides with local people and getting into some crazy conversations and just asking lots of questions. And now I think about my work and my travel, and we unfortunately don't have as much freedom of time to travel overland. If I have a project in Kyrgyzstan in July, I don't have a month to get there overland, unfortunately, anymore. And so it's something that I am grappling with. It's something that the tourism industry is grappling with. I think that in the short term, and the pandemic has aided this, domestic travel and kind of slow travel and kind of train travel is going to be on the rise. And I also think it's kind of exciting to see how, like United Airways, I believe, just made a carbon neutral statement, and the CEO basically said carbon offsets aren't enough. So they're actually investing in carbon removal technologies. And I think they're partnering with a company in Texas. I don't know all the details, but I think that's actually a very positive step if more companies start thinking in terms of carbon removal than just carbon removal and disposal than just carbon offsets. But in the short term, carbon offsets are kind of where we're at. I personally tend to focus my carbon offsets, if I call them carbon offsets, on tree planting programs, which I know is not great, but it is going to be a reality for the near future. But the other thing that our work in sustainability has also shown is the carbon footprint of travel doesn't end just with the airplane or with the transport. Actually, food is one of the biggest problems, or one of the biggest footprints for travelers. And I think that's one of the things we don't really think about. You know, we think about the flights, we think about, maybe the accommodation, but it turns out that food actually has a big role as well, because we're often eating out. A lot of places focus on meat. There's a lot of food waste. And so all these little things together can help reduce the carbon footprint overall in travel. But yeah, it is definitely.
You guys, on top of your database of travel resources, you'll have to invent an app that allows people soup to nuts through their travel, their eating, everything to track their carbon.
There are actually, I think there might be already.
There's several under development. Yeah,
and actually one of the things that, like one of the projects that we're working on with this ecotourism consortium in the Mediterranean, is they work with the Footprint Network, and they actually developed an ecotourism calculator. So it's like they measure everything that happens on that tour package. And on the one hand, it's fabulous. On the other hand, for the local operators, they're pulling their hair out, because it's like, how many square meters? And then what's your electricity provider? And what's this? But it actually provides a really great measurement, and to see how you can make small tweaks and changes and what impact that has. And I think that's going to be coming, like, I think that type of measurement and monitoring is going to become more mainstream. And I think partly is because travelers and consumers are going to ask about it. Like, they're going to start demanding more, which isn't a bad thing.
Yeah. Danielle, hopefully this answers your question. I think we'll definitely share that in the LinkedIn group too. We are close to finishing up. We have 5 more minutes. If there are any other questions, I know we had a question on climate action and communications, and why that is important to brand value.
I think it's incredibly important to brand value. I think there's a lot. So working in sustainable tourism, we used to joke that we would do marketing for sustainable tourism and never use the word sustainable. Because often for travelers, they just thought, oh, that means something boring, it means something expensive, it was just really misunderstood. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity right now with the focus on the climate crisis, with the focus on sustainability. We're finally kind of getting to that point where we can tell inspiring stories about the work that we're doing. I can't tell you how many times I come across an organization and I'm like, wow, this is amazing. How come no one knows about this? And so it's not just about, increasing your brand value, but it's also about kind of letting other people know about it in terms of sharing solutions, in terms of finding ways to cooperate, maybe building on different projects. And I think more and more, and especially for Gen Z and millennials, they're looking to support brands that are doing good, for lack of a better word, that care about the environment, that care about people, that are focused on social impact, that are taking a stand and doing something about the climate crisis and taking it seriously. So there is value in sharing that story because you're also bringing your customers along with you. And I think the other important thing is to show transparency, at least in travel. That's incredibly important to counteract greenwashing, because unfortunately there's been a lot of that in the early days of sustainable tourism. People just put a leaf up without actually having anything behind it. And people saw through it. And so now the importance of transparency and showing what the journey is like. Sometimes you do have pitfalls, sometimes things happen, but to show that you're deliberate and you're making that effort and that journey, it helps bring people along. And it also inspires other companies as well. And the more companies we have working on this, then the better.
Absolutely. I see Charlene has just shared an idea for a platform for offsetting. So we'll grab that and share that in the LinkedIn network too. I'm sure I speak for everyone, Audrey, when I say, wow, I'm so thrilled to have you speak, and your experience is just, it's unbelievable. And thank you for the work that you're doing, and good job too. As you say, storytelling, I'm a communicator as well. Storytelling is so central to finding solutions and to working to solve this crisis. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you, everybody. We'll be following up with everyone via email. We'll also be sharing a survey of our members in order to garner a little bit of data where we can start with some of the information sharing and idea sharing that we're hoping to develop together as an organization. So look out for that as well. Thank you so much, Audrey. We really appreciate it. Have a wonderful day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.